It was actually a New York Times article that came out with had some provided some additional detail about the decision to essentially give up on the Houthi bombing campaign. It more or less confirms what we had said earlier, but I think it's actually of just earth-shaking importance. I think most people, a lot of people in the world, are just ignoring it. But just what it's telling us about U.S. military power and about the current state of military technology. Um, yeah, there was after a month of intensively bombing the Houthis, the the U.S. military realized that they just weren't making any headway, and they needed to make a decision, maybe to change their approach. Um, and actually, um, the U.S. commander for that region advocated an extended bombing campaign of 6 to 8 months to significantly degrade Houthi air defenses and maybe to carry out decapitation strikes too, of the sort that we saw in Lebanon under Israel. That plan was supported by Saudi Arabia, apparently, but it was opposed by UAE. And the UAE said, yeah, we tried that before. Remember, we fought the Houthis for years, and I think you're just underestimating their resilience. So it was decided to compromise and to have kind of to try to squeeze that 6 to 8 month campaign into a month. But at the end of the month, they just hadn't made any headway. And the problem was that they're running out of missiles and, drawing down their stockpiles, which, supposedly they need for other places like, again, Iran or China. So they decided, yeah, this isn't working. And that's why we got that so-called, agreement. It was nothing formal, but basically it was um, the U.S. halted the bombing campaign, and if the Houthis agreed not to attack U.S. flagged ships, and that's it. But attacks on Israel, on Israeli-linked shipping, that's still fair game for the Houthis. Now, another aspect of this, I thought, which was very, very interesting, is that okay, if you remember, the U.S. Navy was sort of had retreated to the northern part of the Red Sea. Now Yemen is down at the southern end of the Red Sea, so they were trying to maintain some distance. Their ships were under threat even up there, but it was just simply too dangerous to come down to head down south, and where Yemen is and where the ships would be, within really very short range of Houthi missiles. So but they were getting to the point where, these ships had to go back and refuel and reload. Like I've said, I think I mentioned earlier, it's actually not possible to reload them on the seas, especially certain kinds of missiles. You have to go back to special, naval bases to do that. Now you have a choice. Either you go through the Suez Canal or you head south, try to hugging the coastline opposite of Yemen. But both are really very dangerous. If you get into if you head south, then you're within really kind of, you make yourself an easy target for the Houthis, much easier than you are already. So that there was a real risk that, apparently, they understood that there was a real risk that one of their ships could be badly damaged or even sunk. But then if you go north through the Suez Canal, then you're a sitting duck when you're in the canal. And there is a potential that the Houthis could have fired a missile at one of the ships while it was in the canal, and it just has no maneuver room. And so they said, maybe we should just surrender, basically. Of course, they didn't use those terms, but that's what it was. No, I find this just remarkable again. It's just quite extraordinary, and I don't think it should be overlooked or diminished. But again, we're talking about the poorest country in the Arab world, one of the poorest countries in the world. And this is it. It essentially defeated, the U.S. Navy. And the U.S. Navy tried under two different presidents. Now, just stop and think what this means, too. I mean, I think we have to draw some, stop and think what the import of this event really is. One thing is, like, if this was if the U.S. Navy was unable to achieve its objectives in the Red Sea and vis-a-vis the Houthis, how is it going to do so against the Iranians? How is it going to do so against the Chinese, who both of these countries are, much better equipped, much wealthier, much larger, have better technology. How could it succeed? We're talking about months and months of bombing already, under Biden, and then another couple of months under Trump. And in those 2 months, I think, it said like, it was over $1 billion was expended every month. And then on top of that, we had the F-18s falling into the sea and all the drones being shot down. I think it was that initial figure that I gave and I've heard was of $3 billion was about right. It certainly was close to that. And then stop and think also about some recent events, the claims of the Israelis. The Israelis said that, they could, that they had eviscerated Iranian air defenses on that one really minor attack that they carried out. I think it was last October. At first they didn't say that, but then the months after that they started making those claims. And then you just see it repeated in the Western media as fact. Are you telling me that the Israelis and their planes didn't even get over into Iranian airspace because, like the U.S. planes that were flying these sorties against Yemen, they didn't dare to do it. They respected the air defense. The U.S. has these F-35s and F-16s had to avoid Yemeni airspace. And certainly, that's what we had heard about the F-35s that the Israelis flew back in October. They discovered as they approached Iranian airspace that Iranian air defense had already locked onto them, and so they didn't dare actually fly into it. So you're saying that these planes somehow, on this one small, really relatively small scale attack, eviscerated Iranian air defense? Whereas after months of bombing the Houthis, we decided we needed another 6 to 8 months, that to actually seriously degrade the Yemeni air defense. It just doesn't hold water. It just doesn't. I think it just exposes the lie entirely. And you had already pointed out that, well, look, what the Russians have been pummeling the Iranians for, or not the Iranians, right, the Ukrainians for, they wouldn't do that. The Ukrainians for, roughly 3 years with their missiles and, and seriously degrading their military capability. But even after all that time, Ukraine still has sufficient air defense. It's greatly degraded, but still sufficient that the Russians have to be cautious. So you're telling me again, that the Israelis somehow eviscerated the Iranian air defense. Absurd. It's just total nonsense. It's amazing that anybody believes it. I think people just aren't thinking. Again, these facts about what happened in Yemen, that wasn't, a Russian talking point or claims of the Yemenis. This was what the U.S. commanders themselves reported to the New York Times.
So the bombing of Yemen, the Houthis, was largely pushed by Israel. This is the reason that we were getting into it. And the idea was that this would be the stepping stone to the path to war with Iran. But it sounds like it's actually backfired because it provided an educational experience, once again, for Trump and his administration, saying that you want us to go to war with Iran. And they realized that, hey, we can't even defeat the Houthis. Worse, we couldn't even, it sounds like what you're saying, that they couldn't even just give up the fight against the Houthis. They had to reach a deal because they were in danger of actually the U.S. Navy being trapped in the Red Sea, going through the Suez Canal where they might be vulnerable to missile attacks and there's no maneuverability there, or having to go by close to the coast of Yemen south, where they would also be vulnerable. So instead of risking the possibility of some U.S. aircraft or Navy vessel sinking while it's trying to leave, they say, okay, we'll make a deal with you. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
And this was public. This was in the New York Times, right?
Yeah. Not all those, everything except, I don't think the New York Times article covered, the quandary that they were in, like, the fact that they were up at the northern end and they had a choice between the Suez Canal. I got that information, I believe it was from Carl Jha, who's a Chinese commentator. But you stop and it just makes sense. right?
Hmm.
I mean, it's just logical. It's a logical conclusion. If they had to be up there, at the northern end of the Red Sea, as we know they were, and even there they were vulnerable. Yeah, they obviously were running a great risk by coming down south, and then yeah, you just lose the maneuverability once you get into the Suez Canal.
So the rest of the world, if this is so public, it's in the New York Times, and people can draw those conclusions about the U.S. Navy essentially being trapped. Then is the sort of the jig up for U.S. military might? Are maybe people haven't understood, but countries around the world should be aware of it, right?
Yeah, right. Well, again, I think even as a year ago or something, we say, well, the U.S. is really good at beating up on third world countries. And that was true back in the 1990s, the early 2000s, but it doesn't seem to be true anymore. It's this technological revolution that has really, and it has made, I wouldn't say navies obsolete, but highly vulnerable. And aircraft, not obsolete by any means, but it has limited their usefulness. And we saw it. I mean, if I don't think you could find a better demonstration than what we saw in Yemen.
Do you think Israel is aware of this?
I'm sure that many of the IDF commanders are aware of it. I'm sure they are. I don't know if Netanyahu was hearing it or he wants to hear it. That's the problem. Sometimes you get somebody, who believes so much in himself, he just stops listening to good advice. It's an old story. It goes back thousands of years. I know on another, I think I was our subscription only channel, I talked about the romance of the Three Kingdoms. But one thing, another recurring theme in that extraordinary historical novel is, you find the real disasters, the catastrophes that one kingdom or another makes is often because you have a commander or an emperor or a king who starts to believe too much in his own, in his own understanding, his own, in himself and his ability to lead. And you have these advisors who will tell him, oh, what you're doing here is very dangerous. But maybe he does it once and he succeeds, and he just thinks, I'm not going to listen to these people anymore. And then he goes off and they tell him again, oh, no, 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 no. Like I got that last one wrong, but you succeeded, but this is going to be a disaster. Please, emperor or king, don't do it. I advise you don't. And he ignores them. He says he's supremely self-confident, and then catastrophe ensues. So this is something that's going on for a long time. And I think we may be seeing it happen in Israel as well.
With Israel, maybe there is a slight awareness, but I feel like Netanyahu feels like he has no choice.
That too, right?
And it's interesting because the further this has gone on, I think it's becoming more and more difficult to convince Trump and his administration to go to war with Iran. From this Houthi experience, the Mike Waltz, treason fiasco, and now we're seeing Trump visit all these Saudi Arabia, Qatar, not talking to Netanyahu, and then the more that Netanyahu tries to push for war with Iran, it's just the jig is up. He knows what he's doing now. I just feel like war with Iran. Maybe I'm too optimistic, but it feels like it could be off the table now just because Trump is aware of the military realities thanks to our involvement in bombing the Houthis. And then just this rift that he's experiencing with Netanyahu, realizing that, hey, this guy's been wanting to get me into this war, and I realize how disastrous it's going to be now. Is that how you're feeling?
Yeah, I am, but I remain cautious and for the reasons I think I've given before. First of all, we're talking about Trump. And then, we've had this happen in the past where you say, wow, Trump he's barreling ahead in the right direction. And then he does a 180, and so there's just always that risk. But I think you're right. I mean, it's just a accumulation of events makes me more confident that he's going to avoid war with Iran. And it's just the facts, I think I've also made this again and again. The reason that Iran hasn't been attacked anytime in a significant way during the last 20 years is its deterrent capability. And I think the Yemenis, and this is probably one of the reasons, they have various reasons for supporting the Houthis, but they, through the Yemenis, they have demonstrated again, actually, further demonstrated their deterrent capability. And it has to be, it has to be on the minds of all these Pentagon leaders. They're saying, boy, this would be just such a humiliation. Now, I don't even know why, after all this, anybody should be talking about a war against Iran. And I think it really may be off the table for now. And I find the most compelling piece of evidence, something just came to my mind. The B-2s that had been flown to Diego Garcia apparently have been flown back to San Diego or wherever they were previously based. So that kind of tells you, yeah, they're not even thinking about it right now. Now, it's just always, there's Trump and there are all these crazies in his administration. There's Netanyahu. There could be a false flag. So we're not out of the woods, yet, not by a long shot. But yeah, I am encouraged